Hello, my name is Amanda Hope Haley, and I am the red-haired archaeologist. Thank you so much for spending some of your valuable time today getting to know me and previewing future episodes about ancient dirt and dusty finds and what they can teach us about the biblical world. Biblical archaeology is my passion, and as you listen to this podcast, I hope it will start to excite you too. Have you ever read the Old Testament and noticed that the kings who are listed there aren't buried as we would expect? Each one is instead gathered to his fathers, or sleeps with his fathers, or rested with his ancestors, depending on your Bible translation. But what do those phrases actually mean? How are the one percenters of the ancient world laid to rest? Because there are so many different translations of this particular phrase, I'm just going to adopt the New King James Version today and go with that. So the way they put it is gathered to his fathers. The first time we really see this phrase is with King David. He passes away in 1 Kings 2:10, and this is what it says happens to him. He's not buried, he's not put in a tomb or a crypt, nothing like that. It just says that he is gathered to his fathers, which does not make a whole lot of sense to our postmodern minds. If you read through the rest of the kings, you see that any king who was considered to be a really good guy, he would get gathered to his fathers. So this was obviously a pattern of something. It wasn't just a fluke that it happened with David, it happened with everyone. It is surprising to me, looking back at the text, that Samuel was not gathered to his fathers. In 1 Samuel 25:1, it states that Samuel was, quote, buried at his home. So he wasn't gathered to his fathers, he was just buried at his home. So at least we know he was buried, so he went into the earth, and we know the location that it happened. That's something. But think about who Samuel was. He was the last prophet, and he was extremely beloved. Just a few chapters after he dies, King Saul is so confused and doesn't know what to do that he takes the extraordinary step of attempting to contact the prophet Samuel through a medium. Samuel is also the guy who anointed David when he was a teenager. So this guy's one of the most influential characters in the Bible. He has 2 books of the Bible named after him. If you would expect anyone to get the royal treatment, it would certainly be him. I think the reason that he doesn't, quote, gather to his fathers is because the land of Israel was not equipped for that quite yet. At the time Samuel was around, Israel was still a loose confederation of the 12 tribes. They'd conquered lands, they had cities, all of that, but there wasn't a king yet. They weren't a unified society. Jerusalem was not yet the capital. Everyone identified with the tribes that they came from or the home that they came from. And so when Samuel was buried at his home, in a way, he did gather with his ancestors. We know that he was buried, but presumably it happened in a location where the rest of his ancestors were. This would have been extremely important at the time. Saul, who of course is the first king of Israel, you probably also would expect to get the royal treatment and be gathered to his fathers upon his death. But that doesn't happen. King Saul's end is not a very pretty one. In 1 Samuel 31, 8-13, it describes how the Philistines murdered him and his sons, and then they proceed to dismember his body and set him up as a sort of totem for the Philistines to look at and to mock. It's also suggested that he is offered as a sacrifice to their goddess Astarte. Saul made some mistakes. Trying to contact Samuel through that medium was chief among them, but he was still Israel's first king, and that alone demanded respect. So some Israelites went and took him and found his body, and they buried him under a tree. Whether people were gathered to their fathers or buried under trees or buried in their hometowns, the Israelite belief at the time was that the soul went to a place called Sheol. If you're reading through your Bible and you see that, don't picture hell. That is not what the ancient mind would have been envisioning at the time. Sheol was simply a place of the dead. If you want to compare it to something maybe you know a little bit better, think of it more like Hades in the Greek tradition. It was not a place of punishment. It was simply a place of waiting. And I know when I hear about it, and I think about David, who was gathered to his fathers and his descendants who would eventually be gathered unto him, I sort of imagine him down there in a dark area under the surface of the earth, sort of holding court with all of those people. And they're just waiting. They're waiting for the return of their Messiah. Sheol is not a place of torture. It is not a place of punishment. Everyone goes there. But it isn't exactly a happy place either. The people who are down there waiting, they are separated from God. They believed that you had to be in Jerusalem at the temple in order to access God and to worship him properly. And so from Sheol, that is absolutely impossible. And in the Bible, separation from God is actually tantamount to punishment. So it's hard to know exactly what Sheol, was like and what exactly it was for. It wasn't a place of punishment. I don't think it was a place of misery. But it wasn't a happy paradise either, because, you're waiting to be reunited with your God from there. So we know what the words say about how David and Samuel and Saul were buried, but what does that actually look like? What do we see in the ground that better explains what on earth it means to be gathered to your fathers? It certainly sounds like it is a metaphor for something, and it is, but it's also literal, believe it or not. In the ancient world, there were two types of burials: primary burials and secondary burials. Luckily, those are pretty easy phrases. What you find all over Israel, really from the Iron Age on, is the use of tombs. They would be either cut out of rock, or families would find caves somewhere that were naturally open areas, and they would adopt those as their family crypts. Those places of burial would always coincide with the home, with where they were. In the Israelite tradition, the dead ancestors' fate was in a way tied to what the living were doing. Let's take Saul as an example. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, and so he would have wanted to be buried within the lands of the tribe of Benjamin. In the Torah, God takes a significant amount of space explaining exactly the boundaries of each of the 12 tribes of Israel, what their lands will be in perpetuity. Land ownership was very important because it was literally given to them by God. So that was something that families wanted to keep in their families forever. The way this worked with death is that, let's take King Saul, for example. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. He would have wanted to be buried in the land of the tribe of Benjamin because that's where his ancestors were. And being with your ancestors in the afterlife, well, not just your ancestors, but all of your family in the afterlife, was considered a very good thing. I hope you like your in-laws. And then his descendants who lived in the land afterward, they were charged with keeping it going. They had cities there, they farmed there, all of that. It was very important that the people who were living were responsible with the land that they had been given, and that they keep it going for generations to come. Those two things worked together to ensure a good afterlife for the ancestors. The judge and prophet Samuel is a little bit of a different case because he was a Levite. The tribe of Levi were charged with maintaining all of the religious requirements for the worship of God, and they didn't actually have a specified piece of land that was their own. Instead, within each of the other tribes of Israel, they would have a parcel of land that would be dedicated to them. So it is that piece of land that Samuel goes back to, and that is where he is buried, as opposed to, say, being honored with a state burial in Jerusalem. That simply wasn't a thing yet. So beginning with the Iron Age, let's say beginning with David, it's a good way to think about it, you have primary burials. What would happen is a family would go into the family tomb, which was either a natural cave or had been carved out of rock by the family members, and the individual who died would be laid flat on his or her back in the center of the tomb. That's a primary burial. Whenever the next person in the family passed away, the family would return to that tomb with that body, and they would need to put it somewhere. Presumably, the person who most recently passed away is still there laying, as I see it, in the middle of the floor, just laying flat there, and has been decomposing for however long it has been. Once all of the flesh and everything is decomposed from the bones, once there's nothing left there but dry bones, the family members would pick up those bones and move them. And in the place where the last dead family member was, the new one would then be laid so that his decomposition process could begin. All of these bones, when they were moved, that is what is the secondary burial. There were two main ways that the ancients did this. Some of the tombs, some of the crypts would actually have areas that were carved out, little almost like sink shapes, where the bones would be put and they would stay there. So all of the bones of one person would be gathered together and just put in basically a more efficient piece of space. In this way, King David and the people who followed him were literally gathered to their ancestors or buried with their fathers. Their bones would be gathered together and they would be laid aside the other members of their family who had passed away before. So this is literally a picture of what is happening. In smaller crypts, or for some reason, maybe it just isn't the fashion to make carved out divots in your tomb. I don't know exactly why, but sometimes people instead would have jars or boxes that they would move the bones into. Those are called ossuaries. They were often clay, especially if they were jar-shaped. They would be made out of clay, or they could be boxes, and those boxes could be from stone or clay, either way. But they all had lids on them, and basically the way we use urns today, only instead of ashes going into it, it would have been the dry bones. If you have ever heard the word ossuary, it is probably because of something that happened in Israel a little over 10 years ago. In 2002, I was sitting at an 8 a.m. Hebrew class inside the refectory. I believe I've told you guys about this before. And my professor came in with just the biggest news ever, for those of us sitting there anyway. And that was someone had found a box that had an ossuary that had the inscription on the side, James, brother of Jesus. This was a huge deal. Immediately, everyone is saying, this is evidence that Jesus was alive. It was adopted by evangelicals and theologians and scholars alike. Everyone was just fascinated by this discovery. Everyone was really excited about this discovery, but it had a huge problem. And that is, it was not found during an archaeological excavation. It was not found in what we call in situ. That is a Latin phrase that basically means an artifact is found exactly where it was dropped by our ancestors several thousand years ago. It hasn't been moved in thousands of years. That's really important for dating specifically, because you can see where it is in the ground. You can compare it to the other items around it. You can look at the strata of the dirt and figure out, within 100 years or so, exactly when that item would have been left in that location. When something is found in situ, it has a good, what we call provenance, which is a French word that basically means the background history of the item. We know where it came from. All of this adds up to, if it's found in situ and it has a proven provenance, then it's real. It's not fake. And that was the problem with the James ossuary. That is why it got so much news. That is why it was so popular. The nation of Israel ended up seizing the box from the owner so that it could be tested to find out if it was real or if it was a forgery, because this was simply owned by a collector. Because it was in the hands of the collector, it was at least possible that the item was a fake or had been illegally stolen. When you're in Israel, all of the antiquities that are in the ground or out of the ground, they are owned by the state of Israel. So the state found out about this ossuary, came in, took it from the collector, and spent about 10 years researching it. They ended up going to court. The owner was indicted for theft, essentially. But after 10 years of a lot of drama and a lot of arguing, the state of Israel ended up returning the box to the owner because no one could prove it was a forgery, but no one could prove that it was real either. That's a shame. The discovery of the ossuary and the movement of the ossuary away from the place of its secondary and most likely primary burial was a violation of the fifth commandment. In the ancient world, the Israelites believed that the fifth commandment, which is honor your mother and your father, was tied into the death rituals. You honored them by keeping the family line going. You honored them by not disturbing them, by allowing them to rest. If that ossuary was genuine, and it was an ossuary, what was really in question was whether or not the inscription on it was new or old. When that ossuary was moved, it, according to the Israelites, interfered with that person's afterlife. Of course, if you're a Christian, you don't believe that all Jews need to have such a permanent, unmovable burial. Here we are shortly after Easter, and when I'm talking about rock-hewn tombs, the first thing that comes to mind is the Garden of Gethsemane, the Garden Tomb over in Jerusalem. That area is maintained by a Catholic organization, and they state that that is the tomb where Jesus was laid after his crucifixion. This may or may not be correct. Frankly, if you go to Jerusalem, there are 3 entirely different burial places for Jesus, and each has a good reason for believing that that's the spot. So I hope you get to go check it out one day. After Jesus' crucifixion, the story is told that a man named Joseph of Arimathea had a new tomb, and that he essentially donated this for Jesus' burial. Now that we know a little bit more about how burials worked and why they were so important to the Israelite and later Jewish faith, it matters that that was a new tomb. For one, as Christians, we believe that Jesus was the Son of God. And so along his male line, he wouldn't have had any ancestors to literally be gathered to. So there was no logical place for him to be buried. This is why it needed to be a new tomb, so that he wasn't joining up with anybody else's family for all of eternity. As it turned out, since he resurrected 3 days later, that new tomb no longer had an occupant. So I think it probably worked out pretty well for Joseph of Arimathea that he would be able to go on and use that tomb for his family in the future. The book of Matthew, which is the most Jewish of all of the Gospels, talks a little bit about the raising of the dead. In Matthew 27, verses 51 through 53, after Jesus has died, it is described that the dead, they rise up, and then they wait in their tombs. And after 3 days, when Jesus is resurrected, they too leave those tombs, walk around and talk to people. Matthew actually says that they went and talked to people. I feel like this is one of those little sections of the Bible that churches don't tend to talk a whole lot about. And I think it's because it's pretty mysterious. This is not something that we can grasp very well. But because we understand how burials worked, we can imagine how this might have physically looked in the world. Now, those 3 or 4 verses of scripture, they require a study all on their own. That is certainly not something that we can discuss today. I think it's fair to say that burial practices have changed a lot since 1000 BCE. We don't just use tombs and crypts. Sometimes we're buried in the ground. Some people choose cremation. There's all sorts of different ways that we can choose to have our bodies treated after we're gone. But one thing that has remained mostly consistent is the desire for families to stay together. If you walk around the city cemetery in my hometown, you will see sections of the cemetery that are actually marked off for particular families. Some of them have been there for 200 years, and they still have plots waiting for future generations to come and be joined to them. That idea of being physically together with your family in eternity is an ideal that we have maintained. For Christians, it doesn't have the same spiritual significance that it would have for the Israelites of the Old Testament, but it's still a tradition that's comfortable to follow. When my father's parents passed away, they hadn't made any plans for where they wanted to be buried. So my father and his sisters ended up choosing that city cemetery in our hometown for them to be laid in. And they're both there today next to each other. And since then, my parents have decided that they're going to be buried there too. And I think David and I are going to be as well. So there is a certain comfort in the continuity of your family at the end of life. Even if hanging around with them in the underworld for all of eternity is not everyone's idea of a good time. If you enjoyed this episode of The Red-Haired Archaeologist, then I hope you will listen again soon. New episodes will be released each Friday. To learn more about me, check out my website, amandahopehaley.com. There you will find links to my books, this podcast, and my blog, where you can interact with me and other listeners.